In the Great Hall of the Orion Interstellar Academy, students from many worlds filled the seats. The air was alive with voices clicking, hissing, and humming as the young minds from across the galaxy waited for the start of the next lesson. The walls of the hall were high and curved, covered with shining silver panels that reflected the bright blue light from the ceiling. In the center of the stage stood a tall figure, the professor, dressed in a dark robe with a deep hood, his face hidden in shadow. Behind him, a massive display screen flickered to life, showing the title of the lesson for the day, The Fall of Primitive Civilizations. The words glowed in gold across the screen. The chatter in the room began to fade. As the professor raised a hand, the motion slow and precise. The crowd grew quiet. The only sound left was the soft hum of the energy lights. The professor stepped to one side, and the first image appeared on the display. It was an old image of a human city. The streets were filled with smoke, buildings, half-broken flames rising into the sky, and the foreground soldiers in simple armor ran forward, shouting, their faces full of fear and rage. A few students snorted with laughter. A group of insectoid beings in the third row clattered their mandibles in amusement. The image changed to one of hunger, lines of thin human children standing with bowls in their hands, eyes empty and hollow. A tall feline alien in the back leaned toward his friend and whispered loud enough for many to hear, "They look like animals fighting for scraps." The next image was worse, a sea of soldiers clashing in muddy ground, explosions lighting the scene. The sound of the old recording filled the hall, deep booms of weapons, screams of the dying. The smell of burned air even reached some of the more sensitive alien noses. Many in the class covered their faces, but the laughter grew anyway. Then a deep voice cut through the noise. It came from the left side, where the reptilian student sat. His skin was covered in dark green scales, his eyes narrow and shining like blades. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, and spoke in a tone dripping with scorn. "Humans, the galaxy's biggest mistake." The room burst in a laughter, the sound echoing up to the high ceiling. Some students hit their desks with their claws or hands, tails flicking in amusement. The mockery was not soft, it was loud, raw, and without shame. The professor did not laugh. He did not even smile. He stood still, his shadowed face turned toward the reptilian student, and then slowly scanned the whole room, his eyes hidden, yet his presence heavy. There was something in the way he stood that made a few of the students feel a cold shiver in their spines. The laughter continued for a few seconds, but began to weaken as they noticed the silence from the man at the front. He pressed a button on the console, and the image changed again. This time, it showed a human child holding a crude wooden stick, standing in front of a ruined home. The child's eyes were fierce, no fear, no tears, only fire. Yet the professor said nothing. He let the image hang there, letting the students stare. One of the avian students in the front row tilted her head and whispered to her seatmate, "Why show these failures? Everyone knows humans burned their own worlds and destroyed their own kind." of seatmate, a small amphibian, nodded and said they could not even reach the stars without killing each other. First, both of them giggled, but their voices felt smaller now. The reptilian student leaned forward again, wanting to press the insult. He said loud enough for all to hear, "Weak minds, weak hearts, weak bodies, a mistake that should have been erased long ago." His tail slapped the floor as he laughed, but this time the sound was alone in the hall. The professor's head lifted slightly, the shadows shifted, revealing the faint glint of eyes. They were sharp, cold, but also deep, like they held a storm waiting to break. He still did not speak, but his gaze swept over every student in the room, the kind of gaze that made some turn their eyes away, as if looking at him too long would reveal something they did not want to know. The silence stretched, it grew heavy, pressing on the room like invisible gravity. Even the hum of the lights seemed quieter. The professor stepped forward, each footstep slow and deliberate. The sound of his boots against the metal floor was steady, like the ticking of some great clock counting down to something none could name. A few students shifted in their seats, feeling an unease they could not explain. The insectoid students folded their arms across their chests, clicking nervously. The avian tilted her wings in discomfort. The reptilian student narrowed his eyes, but his smirk had faded. The professor stopped in the center of the stage. Behind him, the image of the human child still burned on the display. The flames of the ruined home behind the child flickered. The professor finally spoke, his voice low, but carrying through the hall. Without effort, "You think you know what you see. You think these images tell the whole story." His words rolled like distant thunder, calm, yet warning of something greater. The reptilian student let out a short laugh, but it was forced. It held none of the earlier joy. The professor tilted his head slightly, his eyes fixed on the reptilian, and then moved to the rest of the class. He said, "You see weakness. I see something else." He did not say what that something else was. Instead, he pressed the button again, and the screen went black. The darkness behind him made his figure seem taller, his shadow stretching across the walls like a silent guardian. No one laughed. Now the students waited for him to continue, waited to see what would come next. There was a strange feeling in the room, something like the moment before a storm breaks, heavy still and full of tension. The professor's hands rested on the console, but his fingers tapped once, twice, 3 times, a slow rhythm, like a heart beating in the dark. In that moment, none of them could explain why, but they felt as if the man before them knew something they did not, and that whatever it was, it would change the way they saw humans forever. The silence in the hall stretched longer than any of the students expected. The stillness felt heavy, as if the air itself had thickened around them. The professor stood without moving, his dark robe hanging still against his frame. His face was still partly hidden in shadow, but there was something in the way he breathed, slow, steady, measured, like someone waiting for the right moment to strike. Without a word, he pressed another button, and the black screen behind him came to life again, this time showing a strange map. It was marked with glowing red lines cutting across stars and planets. Names of long-lost battles and forgotten systems faded into the corners. The professor's voice finally broke the silence, his tone deep. "And even tell me why you believe humans are weak." His gaze swept over the alien faces waiting for answers. A tall avian with bright silver feathers raised one claw and said, "Because they fight without logic. They throw away their lives like scraps of food for the fire." The words earned a few quiet chuckles from the back rows, but they died quickly as the professor's eyes moved toward them. Another answer came from a wide shell-covered amphibian who spoke in a slow, bubbling voice. "Because they cannot live long enough to master true knowledge. They are born, they breed, they die before they learn patience." The professor nodded slightly, his expression unreadable, yet his voice carried an edge. "And yet they survive battles against those older than the stars, battles against enemies who could erase worlds with a single command. If they were so weak, how could they do this?" The question hung in the air like a blade. No one moved to answer. The reptilian student shifted in his seat, his scaled tail curling tighter under his chair as his sharp eyes locked on the professor. No one spoke. The silence returned until the professor stepped toward the display, his hand brushing across the surface, causing the map to dissolve into moving images. The first showed a small human fleet cornered by a massive alien armada. The human ships were smaller, slower, yet they moved like dancers, weaving between blasts of energy, striking back in sudden bursts that tore through the enemy lines. The footage showed human pilots making impossible turns, throwing their ships into fire to protect others. Some students leaned forward, watching closely, a faint hum of curiosity replacing the earlier sound of mockery. The professor let the image play for a while before speaking again. "You see chaos, I see adaptability. You see waste, I see sacrifice." His words made the insectoid students click their mandibles uneasily. One whispered to another in a fast, chittering tongue, but stopped when the professor's gaze swept their way again. The scene on the screen changed this time to a battlefield on the surface of a frozen moon. Humans in thick armor moved through blizzards, their bodies nearly frozen, yet they pressed forward, their breath visible in the icy air. One carried another on his back across open ground, while enemy fire streaked past. Both fell, but the carried soldier was pushed into cover just before the one carrying him collapsed, unmoving. The room was still. The laughter from earlier felt distant now, replaced with a strange quiet tension. The professor's voice dropped lower. "You call them primitive, yet they fought not for glory, not for reward, but for each other." The reptilian student broke the quiet with a snort. Perhaps they simply lacked fear, or perhaps they were too foolish to know when to give up. His words were sharp, but they no longer carried the same easy confidence as before. The professor turned to face him fully, his figure still wrapped in shadow, his voice now edged with something colder. "Perhaps, or perhaps they understood something you do not." He walked back toward the console, his movements slow but full of purpose. He tapped the controls again, and a new set of images appeared. This time, they were not battles, but moments after battles, humans tending to wounded aliens, feeding strangers from other worlds, holding the hands of dying enemies. To give them comfort, the faces of the humans were tired, worn, but steady. A murmur moved through the class as they watched these scenes. An avian whispered softly, "I did not know they did this." The amphibian next to him said, "I did not think they could care for those not their own kind." The professor's eyes scanned the class, and he spoke with a voice that carried like steel and water. "You think survival is only about strength of body, but strength of heart matters more in the end." He turned away from the screen and let the images fade into darkness. Once more the hall seemed colder now, as if the light itself had dimmed. The reptilian shifted again, but did not speak. The insectoid students kept their claws still. The avians kept their wings folded tightly. The professor's silence was louder than words. Then he asked another question. "Tell me, if they were so weak, why are they remembered? Why does their name still make some flinch? Why do the records of their wars remain forbidden in half the galaxy?" No one answered. The quiet grew until it felt like the walls themselves were listening. The professor looked over them one by one, as if measuring each of their souls, his eyes hidden, but his voice carrying an unshakable weight, "Because those you call weak have left scars that never fade." He walked slowly toward the front row, his boots hitting the floor with a steady sound that echoed in the grand space. The reptilian student found himself sitting straighter as the professor passed his desk. Without even looking at him, the air around the man seemed heavier now, the kind of weight that made breathing just a little harder. The professor stopped in the very center of the hall and turned toward them all. "I will show you more, and then you will decide if they were weak or if they were something else." Without waiting for agreement, he tapped the console again, and the lights dimmed further, the ceiling lights narrowing into a single beam on the display. The screen lit with the first moments of another story, the kind that would change the way every student in that room thought of humans forever. The screen brightened, and the new images appeared, showing a battle no one in the class had ever seen before. The footage was grainy, as if it came from a time long past, but the details were still clear enough to feel the weight of what was shown. A dark sky hung over a burning valley, and in that valley a lone human stood holding a weapon that looked far too small for the enemy. Before him, the enemy was a towering machine with armor like black stone and eyes that glowed red with the light of some terrible power. The human did not run, he did not hide, he stood his ground as the machine raised a weapon of its own. A beam of pure fire roared toward him, but the human moved with sudden speed, diving aside and firing again and again, the shots bouncing off the armor until one lucky strike found a weak point. The machine staggered and fell in the background. Others emerged, but the human ran straight toward them, screaming with rage and defiance. Some students in the class leaned forward, unable to look away. A few whispered in their own languages, wondering why anyone would fight alone against such odds. The professor let the footage play without comment, his hands resting on the console, his body still as stone. The reptilian student tapped his claws against the desk, but he made no sound with his mouth, his earlier arrogance now replaced with a look of deep thought. The footage changed again, showing a space station under siege, its walls shaking as enemy ships pounded it with fire. The camera followed a group of humans running through corridors carrying wounded allies of many species. Some of the allies were enemies from earlier wars, yet the humans shielded them with their own bodies. One human was struck by a blast and fell, but still pushed the alien in his arms into cover before collapsing. The screams in the background were real, not acted, not staged, and the smell of burning metal seemed to fill the hall, even though it was only an image. The professor's voice was low but steady. When he spoke, you see here a truth that cannot be denied. They fought even for those who once sought to destroy them. They gave themselves so others might live. The insectoid students exchanged uneasy glances, their mandibles clicking in slow rhythm, as if unsure whether to agree or resist. The avians kept silent, their wings shifting as they watched the frozen face of a human woman staring down the camera before rushing into the smoke. Another scene filled the display this time. It was a council chamber filled with alien leaders, their faces grim as they argued. The humans were there too, not with threats, not with weapons, but with words. Their leader stood firm, his voice strong, as he spoke of peace and unity. The footage showed him convince those who had sworn never to speak to one another again, to sign an agreement, the kind that could stop an entire galaxy from burning. The amphibian student in the front finally spoke in a slow voice. I thought they only made war, but this shows something else. The professor looked toward him and gave a single slow nod. The reptilian student finally broke his silence, his voice quieter now than before. Perhaps they were not so weak, but they still fell, they still vanished in time. The professor's gaze locked on him, and for a moment the room seemed to grow colder. He stepped forward, his robe brushing the floor. As he moved, each step echoing in the grand hall. Perhaps, or perhaps they became something the galaxy was not ready to face. The students shifted uneasily, the weight of his words pressing into their thoughts. The professor turned back to the console and brought up the final image for this part of the lesson. It showed a small human settlement, not during war, not during famine, but during peace. Children running across green fields, alien children, among them humans working side by side, with others planting, building, laughing. The sight was so simple, so quiet, and yet it carried more strength than the battles before. He let the image hang there in silence. Then he spoke again. There is strength in battle, yes, but greater strength in what comes after, and humans understood this better than most. The hall was silent, now, and no laughter, no whispers, only the faint hum of the display. The students sat watching the still image, as if afraid to look away. The reptilian's eyes were narrowed, not with scorn, but with thought. The insectoids had stopped moving entirely. The avians kept their heads bowed slightly. The professor's hands rested on the edge of the console, and his voice took on a tone almost like a challenge. Tell me now, do you still call them weak? No one spoke. The silence itself was the answer. The professor's eyes moved from one face to another, reading them without expression, but in that silence a question began to grow in the minds of several students. Why did he speak with such care about humans? Why did his voice carry a shadow of something deeper? The reptilian finally asked the question aloud. Why do you defend them so much? Why do you care? His tone was not mocking this time. It was searching. The professor stood still for a moment, his head tilting slightly, as if weighing the truth. Then he gave a small, almost invisible smile. I have seen what they can do. He pressed another control, and the display went dark once more, leaving only the dim blue light from the ceiling and the long shadows across the hall. You will see more before this lesson, Incy said, and then perhaps you will understand. The students leaned back, waiting for whatever would come next, yet some felt a strange unease, as if the professor was not just teaching them history, but leading them to a place they had never been, a place where the truth about humans would no longer be just a story, but something far more real. The room remained wrapped in that strange, heavy silence as the professor reached toward the console. Once more, his fingers gliding across the smooth surface. The lights dimmed even further until the hall felt like a cavern, lit only by the screen. The new image came into view this time. It was not a battle or a peaceful scene. It was something in between, a vast wasteland under a burning orange sky, where human survivors walked through dust storms carrying their wounded and searching for shelter. The students leaned forward, trying to make sense of what they saw. The figures moved slowly, yet there was no panic, no chaos, just a determined, steady march across the ruins. The camera zoomed in on a human woman carrying a small alien child. Her own arm injured, her face streaked with dirt and blood, yet her eyes fixed firmly ahead. The professor's voice was almost a whisper as he said, they had nothing left, no food, no safe place, no allies, and yet they kept walking until they found a place where others could be saved. The reptilian student's claws tapped quietly against his desk, but this time the sound was not mocking, it was restless. The avian students sat still, their feathers lying flat. The insectoid group shifted uneasily as the dust storm on the screen roared louder. The scene changed, showing a vast hall much like the one they sat in now, filled with leaders from dozens of worlds arguing, their voices loud, their faces twisted with anger. In the middle of the chaos stood a single human, unarmed, unarmored, speaking words that cut through the shouting. The human's tone was calm, yet full of weight, and one by one the voices around him fell silent. The professor's eyes stayed on the image, and his words came out slower than before. They could silence storms without raising a weapon. One amphibian student muttered in a low tone that his power of a different kind. The professor's gaze flicked toward him and then back to the rest. Without warning, the image shifted again to something far darker, a fleet of alien warships descending on a world the humans defending it were hopelessly outnumbered, yet the footage showed them boarding enemy ships in small squads, disabling weapons from inside, while their own ships burned in orbit. One human was shown cutting the power to an entire battleship with his last act before the hull gave way and the stars swallowed and the room was silent. But the weight of what they saw pressed hard on every mind. The professor walked slowly to the edge of the stage, his shadow long across the floor, his voice no louder than before, but it carried through every corner. You look for strength in numbers and weapons, but they had strength in while they fought, even when all logic said to surrender. A faint tremor entered his voice, though most would not have noticed. He pressed the button again, and now the display showed something no one expected: a gathering of humans and aliens sitting together around a fire, sharing food, telling stories, children from different worlds laughing together in the glow of the flames. The reptilian student leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied the scene. The professor said softly, "They could make family out of strangers and trust out of enemies. This is why they endured." One avian in the second row finally spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "Why does this matter to you so much, Professor? What are they to you?" Her words seemed to hang in the still air. The professor stood motionless for a moment, then stepped back toward the console, pressing his palm to it. The image froze on the firelit faces. His voice, when it came, was measured, "Because I have walked where they walked, and I have seen what they left behind." The reptilian student's eyes flickered with something like realization, but he stayed silent. The insectoids sat frozen, their antennae barely moving. The professor's eyes scanned them all, as if searching for who among them might understand. The display changed again, showing a single starship drifting in the void, its hull marked with burns and scars, its name barely visible along the side. The footage moved inside, where humans worked side by side with alien allies, repairing the damage, tending to the wounded. The camera lingered on one human captain, giving orders with calm authority, even as sparks rained down around him. The professor said this ship was the last of its fleet, yet it returned with every survivor it could carry, even enemies it had fought only days before. The avians exchanged uneasy glances. The amphibian in front gripped the edge of his desk. The reptilian leaned back, his tail curling tight around his chair, leg. The air in the hall felt thicker now, as if the walls themselves were listening. The professor moved closer to the front, his shadow falling over the first row, and he spoke again, almost in a challenge. "What would you do if you faced a force stronger than your armies, faster than your ships, older than your history? Would you fight until you fell, or would you stand until the last of you could no longer breathe?" The question sank into the silence. The students avoided each other's eyes. The reptilian's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The avian, who had spoken earlier, lowered her gaze to the floor. The insectoids did not click their mandibles this time. The professor stepped back and turned toward the display, pressing the console again. The screen went black. The lights rose, slightly casting the hall in a cold, pale glow. He looked at them all and said, "This is not just history. It is a warning and a lesson, and it is one you must learn before it is too late." He turned away from them for a moment, as if deciding what is shown next. Then his hand rested on the console. One more time the screen flickered, but instead of images it showed lines of data, star coordinates, ship logs, and encrypted records. The title above them read, "Restricted Human Archive Access Denied." Without turning his head, he said, "There are things you have not seen because they are hidden from you, things that will change what you think you know." The reptilian leaned forward again, his eyes sharp. "What kind of things, Professor?" His voice was quiet, but it carried across the hall. The professor looked over his shoulder, and his voice came low but steady. "The kind of things that tell you why their name still carries weight in the farthest reaches of space." He let the words hang in the air, then shut down the screen. The sudden darkness behind him made his figure seem larger and more solid. The class sat frozen, waiting for whatever would come next, as if each of them knew deep down that they were on the edge of hearing something they were never meant to know. The hall was still so quiet that every small sound seemed louder: the faint hum of the lights, the slow scrape of a chair, as one student shifted. The professor stood with his back to the class, his hands resting lightly on the console, as if he were weighing what to reveal next. Then, without a word, he tapped a hidden key. The screen behind him lit up once more. This time it showed the image of a vast black void speckled with stars in the distance. A fleet of warships floated like shadows against the darkness. The footage zoomed in, revealing ships of many species, all heavily armed and ready for battle. The professor's voice came low and steady. This was the day the combined fleet of 7 worlds prepared to destroy the last human colony. The image shifted to show the colony itself, a small cluster of domes on the surface of a cold, barren world. Children played inside the protective barriers, their laughter faint under the sound of distant alarms. The humans knew what was coming, yet none of them fled. Instead, they worked to hide as many non-combatants as possible, even as the sky filled with the dark shapes of incoming ships. Some students in the room frowned. A reptilian's jaw tightened. The avians tilted their heads in uneasy silence. The insectoids held their antennae. Still, the professor continued. They did not have the numbers to win. They did not have the weapons to match their enemies. But they had something else, and it was enough. The footage changed again, showing small human craft launching into the sky, weaving between enemy ships, their movements unpredictable. They were not fighting to destroy the fleet. They were fighting to distract it, pulling enemy fire away from the colony below. Each maneuver bought precious minutes for those still evacuating. In the background, larger enemy ships struggled to target them as they darted in and out of range. The professor's voice hardened. Every pilot knew they would not return. Every pilot went anyway, and some of those they protected lived because of it. The reptilian shifted in his seat, but did not speak. His eyes locked on the screen as the image changed once more, now showing the interior of a human command center, officers giving orders calmly, even as the walls shook with the impact of enemy fire. One officer turned to the camera and said, "Tell them we held until the end." Then the feed cut to static. The hall was silent, the students staring as the professor let the image fade, his voice softer now. They did not measure victory by survival. They measured it by how many others they could save. An avian student raised one wing, hesitating before speaking. Why would anyone fight knowing they cannot win? The professor's eyes fixed on her. Because sometimes it is not about winning, it is about refusing to give in to those who would break you. He pressed the console again, and a new sequence began, this one showing a hidden archive of human technology, strange devices half-built and half-destroyed, logs describing experiments in travel beyond known space, weapons capable of bending light, shields that could hold against suns. Yet the files were marked classified. The professor let them scroll across the screen before saying, "You think they vanished because they were weak, but perhaps they simply stepped where no one else could follow." The insectoid students shifted again, their mandibles clicking in a nervous pattern. One finally asked, "Where did they go, Professor?" The man gave no answer, only a faint smile that did not reach his eyes. The footage faded, leaving only darkness for a long moment. Then the professor turned away from the console and walked slowly toward the center of the hall, his boots striking the floor in slow, measured steps. The reptilian's gaze followed him closely, his tail curling and uncurling, as if sensing that something was about to be revealed. The professor stopped halfway to the front row and looked across the faces of the class. You have seen their battles, their losses, their victories, their compassion. You have heard of their will to fight and their will to protect, but still you sit wondering if it matters, if any of it was real. I tell you now, it was real, every part of it, and more that you have yet to see. His words seemed to press into the air. The students leaned forward unconsciously, as if pulled toward him. He let the silence linger before continuing. There was a war, one you will not find in your public records, one where the humans stood alone against something so ancient, so vast, that even speaking its name would draw fear into the hearts of entire worlds. The avian's feathers ruffled. The amphibian gripped the sides of his desk. The insectoids froze. The reptilian's eyes narrowed with interest. The professor's voice was calm, but each word seemed to carry something deeper. They fought it, and they won, but it cost them everything. And when the dust cleared, they were gone, not destroyed, not erased, but gone. He stepped closer to the front row, lowering his voice, though it still reached every ear in the room. Some say they hid themselves. Some say they became something else. Some say they walk among us, even now, unseen. The reptilian leaned forward, his voice a low growl. "And which do you believe, Professor?" The man's gaze held his without flinching. "Perhaps I believe more than one thing is true." He turned then, moving back toward the console, his robe swaying with each step. His hand hovered over the controls, but did not touch them. Instead, he looked back at the class's expression, unreadable. The truth is dangerous knowledge, and not all are ready to bear it. But you have asked, and I will answer in time. The students sat still, their eyes locked on him, the earlier arrogance and laughter now completely gone, replaced by curiosity and something else, a faint unease that whispered there was far more to this lesson than they had imagined. The professor looked over them one last time before turning back to the console, and the hall seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. The air in the grand hall felt heavy and strange as the students slowly returned to their seats after the shocking display from the professor in the last session, and none of them spoke for several long moments because their minds were still filled with the sounds of human war, the cries of victory, and the sight of humans standing tall, even when surrounded by enemies they could not match in size or technology, but could match in spirit and will. The professor stood at the front of the hall, his hands resting on the podium, his eyes scanning every face with calm control. His voice carried softly, yet every word seemed to echo in their ears as he began to speak again. Today, I will tell you not just what humans did, but why they did it, and perhaps you will understand why mocking them is foolish, he said. And the students listened because now they were no longer laughing, they were curious and maybe even a little afraid. He told them of a small group of human explorers who had traveled into uncharted space without powerful weapons, without massive fleets, without any promise of safety, but with the hope of finding allies and knowledge, and how that small group had encountered hostile alien races who saw them as prey, and how those humans had managed to survive through clever thinking, quick action, and pure courage. The reptilian student who had insulted humans before now kept his eyes low, but his tail twitched in unease, for the images of human defiance still burned in his mind, and he could not forget the way they had stared down towering enemies with nothing but crude weapons and their own stubborn hearts. The professor continued with the story of the siege of Red Horizon, a human colony that was surrounded by enemy warships with no chance of escape. And yet instead of surrendering, they used every scrap of material, every piece of metal, every drop of fuel to build traps and tricks that confused and slowed their attackers long enough for a rescue fleet to arrive. And that rescue had only come because the humans had sent a message so bold and so defiant that it inspired distant allies to risk everything to help them. Gasps filled the hall as the professor described the message, a simple broadcast to the enemy that said, "We will not kneel," and those words repeated in the minds of the students over and over like a heartbeat. The hall seemed to shrink as the professor stepped down from the podium and walked slowly among the rows of alien students, his eyes sharp, his presence almost heavy, as he spoke of the many times humans had been underestimated by stronger civilizations, and how every time they had risen from the ashes stronger than before. One insectoid student asked quietly, "Why do they keep fighting when the odds are hopeless?" And the professor stopped and looked directly at her and said, "Because to them surrender is death, and even if death comes, they choose to face it standing." Whispers spread through the hall as the students realized they had been taught about humans only through the lens of defeat and failure, never about their victories, never about their strange and dangerous will to survive. The professor returned to the front and activated the display again, but this time the images were different. They showed humans not in war, but in peace, building great cities on harsh worlds, helping other species rebuild after disasters, sharing food with strangers on planets that were not their own, and yet even in peace there was a fierceness in their eyes, a readiness that never seemed to fade. The reptilian student finally raised his voice again, but this time it was softer and filled with doubt. "Are you saying humans are the most dangerous species in the galaxy?" And the professor gave a faint smile and said, "No, I am saying they're the most unpredictable." Tension hung in the air as the students processed the words, for unpredictability meant they could be friend or foe, savior or destroyer, and one could never truly know which until the moment came. Then the professor turned off the display and said, "I have told you stories and shown you proof, but you still do not understand the full truth of humans to understand that you must know my truth as well." And the way his voice shifted made the room grow colder. He walked slowly to the center of the stage, his hands clasped behind his back as his eyes locked with the students. And he said, "I have lived among humans. I have fought beside them. I have bled with them. and I have learned that they are unlike any other in the galaxy," and the students leaned forward as if pulled by invisible threads. Without warning, the lights dimmed, and a single beam illuminated the professor, casting long shadows against the wall, and in that moment his skin began to change the strange shimmer they had seen before returned, but this time it spread faster, revealing the truth hidden beneath the false alien features they had always known. Gasps and cries filled the room as the professor's form shifted his alien face, melting away to reveal something none of them had ever expected: a human face with sharp eyes and a steady gaze and scars that told their own stories. He stood there silent for a moment, letting them see him for what he truly was: a human standing among those who had mocked his kind, and yet he did not look angry, only calm and certain, as if he'd been waiting for this moment for a long time. The silence was so deep that they could hear the faint hum of the Academy's systems and the slow, steady breathing of the man before them. And then he spoke again in a voice that carried both warmth and warning: "I am human, and I have taught you not to fear us, but to respect us, because those who do not respect us often learn too late why they should have." The reptilian student could not meet his gaze now, for the weight of shame pressed hard on him, and the rest of the class sat frozen, unsure whether to speak or remain silent. The professor's human eyes swept over them all, and then he said, "Next time you speak of humans, remember this moment, remember what you saw and what you learned, and perhaps you will think before you laugh." The lights slowly brightened again, but no one moved, for the truth had settled deep into their minds, and they knew nothing in their understanding of humans would ever be the same again. The silence inside the great hall was so deep it felt like the air itself was holding its breath as the alien students stared at the professor, standing tall and calm before them, his gaze sweeping over each of their faces, as if weighing their worth, and finding them lighter than dust. The faint hum of the Academy's life support system was the only sound in the background, yet even that seemed distant compared to the weight of what had just been revealed. Moments ago, the professor had spoken words that shattered the laughter and arrogance of the class, words that were now sinking deep into their minds with slow, sharp edges. The reptilian student, who had been the loudest in mocking humans earlier, sat frozen, his scaled hands gripping the edge of his desk, while his tail twitched in tiny nervous jerks. His eyes darted left and right, as if searching for some ally to laugh with, but finding none. Every student in the room could still feel the echo of the professor's voice when he had said, "I am human," and for a moment it was as if they could all see a shadow of something vast behind him, a shadow shaped by wars and victories, by a history written in blood and sacrifice, by a resilience they had mocked but never truly understood. The professor took a slow step forward, his boots clicking softly on the polished floor, each step ringing like a drumbeat of inevitability. He stopped in the center of the stage and spoke again in that same calm voice, but now there was a fire under the calm, a slow burning flame that promised storms. Long before your people traveled the stars, humans walked alone in a dangerous world and survived because we had no one to protect us, no one to guide us, and no one to save us from the darkness. We became our own protectors, our own teachers, our own saviors. And when the darkness came for us, we fought it until it bled. The alien students listened without daring to interrupt, their wide eyes reflecting the image of the human who stood before them, no longer a figure of ridicule, but something far older and far more dangerous than they had imagined. The professor's words painted pictures in their minds of ancient battles where humans stood against impossible odds, of cities rising from ashes, of voices singing even when the night was long and cold. He told them of the way humans could argue and fight, yet stand together when the real enemy came, how humans could lose everything, yet still rise again stronger than before. As the images took shape in their minds, the students began to feel something unfamiliar. It was not pity, and it was not fear exactly. It was respect, reluctant at first, but growing with each word. The professor walked slowly among the rows of seats, his eyes locking onto each student for a moment, as if placing a seed of thought in their minds. "I have seen worlds fall," he said quietly. "I have seen species vanish from history because they forgot how to stand together. Humans remember because we had no choice. Survival was not a gift to us, it was a fight every single day. A murmur ran through the class, but no one dared to speak. The weight of the truth was pressing down too heavily. The professor stopped in front of the reptilian student who had mocked humans the most. The young alien shifted uncomfortably under the professor's gaze, his throat working as if swallowing something bitter. The professor's voice was soft but sharp. When you laugh at humans, you laugh at survivors. You laugh at the ones who faced extinction more times than you can count, and learn to make extinction afraid of them. The reptilian student lowered his head, unable to hold the gaze. The professor lingered for a moment longer before moving back to the front of the hall, his steps slow, his presence filling every corner of the space. When he turned to face them again, his eyes seemed brighter, sharper, as if the fire inside him was no longer hidden. There will come a day when you will face something that will not care about your titles or your power or your technology. It will only care if you can endure, and when that day comes, you will remember what I told you today. You will remember the humans, because they will be the ones still standing long after the dust has settled. The words hung in the air like a promise or a warning. None of the students dared to move or speak as the professor turned and slowly walked out of the hall, leaving behind a silence heavy with thought and the faint, almost unspoken truth that the galaxy's biggest mistake was not humans at all. It was underestimating them.